Gender abolitionism can be defined simply as a deconstruction of gender as a social construct, or better described by the International Journal of Gender, Sexuality, and Law as the alter of current state practices regarding sex and gender registration in order to leave policies of mandatory binary gender and sex registration behind. The concept of gender abolition is something that would completely change the way that people view each other. To grasp this concept fully, understanding the historical context of gender is necessary.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars.
The idea of gender being a social construct is a relatively new one. John Money, a zoologist from New Zealand, was credited for this discovery because he was able to link the distinctions between the human sexes and the way that an individual's social upbringing is correlated with said sex, or gender. Sex being the chromosomes and genitalia, and gender being the social role that a person plays in society. Money's involvement in sex and gender led to the idea that someone could in fact change their gender after birth, what is known today as being transgender. Gender being a social construct means that gender started off as an idea that was slowly implemented into human society at a point in history. In other words, gender is not a phenomenon that naturally occurs in human behavior. Rather, it is taught and instilled into people, such as other social behaviors like language or mannerisms.
Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
It is not exactly understood where gender began, but there is a common misconception of how gender has played into early human and hunter-gatherer societies. One of the common misconceptions that is taught is that men hunted and women gathered. This was likely not to be the case, as archaeologists have discovered in the Americas that there are, in fact, sites where females have been associated with the stone tools that are used to hunt and gather. This leads archaeologists and researchers to believe that hunting was, in fact, a gender-neutral activity. With evidence of gender-neutral societies, it's likely that early human hunter-gatherers lived their day-to-day, attributing tasks to people based off of their skills. The concept of gender was likely something that formed from the notable differences between the human sexes, like physical strength and physical attributes. In other words, sex predates gender as a human concept. These sex differences were marked by early human societies, and the binary gender was later created. The question that arises from this is, why were these gender differences created? And what was the cause of the gender differences being created?
In other words, hold my hand. In other words, darling, kiss me.
It is impossible to tell when and why gender was created, but it is evident that gender was socially constructed rather than something innate to every person with XX or XY chromosome. Continuing on from how gender was formed, the concept was likely started sometime during agricultural development, so during the Neolithic era, when human labor practices were divided up between males and females societally. This is known as the sexual division of labor, and it was likely something that was introduced into human practices to create more efficiency and organized, growing human societies. It is important to note that the sexual division of labor was an idea that evolved separately in multiple societies over a period of time, rather than starting off in one specific part of society, then spreading. A study contrived by the National Center for Biotechnology Information shows early Central European humans had some sort of division of labor, with males and females being associated with different type of tool. While in proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences studies done in the Americas, found little evidence of the same type of sexual division of labor by using pottery. This research shows the variability of human societies while also asserting that the division of labor is not necessarily societally consistent. The creation of the sexual division of labor led to gender beginning as a concept where the sex parts of people's bodies were a deciding factor of what role they would play and participate in. It is also important to note that the concept of gender is not necessarily a binary in every society, but consistently there are men and women that are acknowledged in societally wide. Since everything about the previous history of gender and sexual division of labor is yet to be fully understood, with the context given, it can be extrapolated that the circumstances of gender creation happened adjacent to this claim.
Fill my heart with song and let me sing forevermore. You are all I long for, all I worship and adore.
Fast forward to modern day society and the concept of patriarchy. The patriarchy can be defined as a systematic oppression of men towards non-men. The patriarchy can be observed today comes from the thousands of years it had to form after the sexual division of labor. The patriarchy still varies from society to society today, but it is commonplace throughout the world. It can simply be observed by how many women and other genders do not hold major forms of power. In other words, there's a power imbalance that exists in the world that has allowed for men to get disproportionate power in comparison to non-men. According to the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report of 2022, women hold about 16% of the global ministerial positions and 22% of the global parliamentary positions. They also include the lack of industry leadership present in women, with specific numbers in industry varying from 19% to 47%. The data given by the World Economic Forum affirms the existence of the patriarchy by showing the lack of power that women do hold in leadership positions. The patriarchy as it exists today does harm all people and individuals, from men to women to people outside of the binary to people within it. It harms all.
In other words, please be true. In other words, I love you.
Focusing on the effects of the patriarchy on women, in current day, women are often seen taking a backseat to their own freedoms, i.e. their bodies, the way they can act in society, or the jobs that they can take. This list goes on and on. Women have a very deep-rooted relationship with the patriarchy that has not only stripped them of their freedoms, but the power to control and manage society as well. Women are limited in how they can express power through systems, for instance, the inability to run for office or the voting restrictions placed on women. Things like this have been damaging to women in how they can achieve political power or any other types of power. Women are also the disproportionate victims of crime, especially crimes like rape and domestic homicides, despite only committing around 10% of the global crimes as a group. Men have a different role to play in the patriarchy. They have the privilege of being high power holders of society. Men are allowed to achieve all types of power in society by just their status, such as being seen as leaders naturally and having a greater access to wealth. But there are downsides that come with this power. For instance, the societal sayings such as boys can't cry and boys have to be strong are taught gender dynamics that limit the expression that men can have. And they do have their consequences. These societal teachings on men are reflected by the underdiagnosis of mental health in men, the negative stigma about men taking care of children, and most consequentially, the higher suicide rates, with men making up 80% of the total suicide. The Victoria state government adds an additional effect like the lack of paternal leave and the difficulty of men to live up to tradition and stereotypes as also being a negative consequence of the patriarchy. But just like with women, there are several more types of consequences that come from the patriarchy than the ones that are listed. Currently, gender is treated relatively similarly throughout all societies due to the Western global hegemony of the concept. But historically, this has not always been the case. For instance, the Aztecs, who practiced a lot more gender equal societies to where women and men could both equally hold positions of power very fairly. It is important to note that the patriarchy, in all of its forms it may take, is still a patriarchy and therefore unequal. The solution to society's problems of gender inequity would be to abolish the genders. This leads to the idea of gender abolition as the next step forward. The earliest account of gender abolition that I could find was remarked in Urania. It was a privately circulated feminist gender studies journal published between 1916 and 1940. The authors consisted of Eva Gore Booth, Esther Roper, Irene Clyde, Dorothy Cornish, and Jessie Wade, 5 feminists who sought to question gender. The journal emphasized the genderless society and was one of the first ideas of gender abolition in the modern day. As I said before about John Money, he was the person who popularized the idea that gender was indeed separated from sex. But as practiced by a lot of feminists in the past, they've already considered and recognized the idea that gender was already different from sex. Within the context of history of gender abolition, there isn't too much to go off of. But it is a very radical and new idea that most of society has not even considered. Gender abolition is an absolute necessity if the true ideas of feminism are to be realized. This is because of the tendency of power to manifest itself unequally. For thought, how could you oppress a category of people that does not exist? If all people are viewed on an individual basis instead of a group one, then there are absolutely no ways of stealing power from said group. To play devil's advocate, what if we took the idea of like liberal feminism, one that promoted equity between genders by law, into society? With this idea, we could see a society such as today, a society where women are equated by the law. This, though, does not necessarily fix the issue at hand. Just as today, even despite equality by the law, society's practices of gender discrimination can still lead to women being victims of several different types of crimes disproportionately, or disproportionately being in the household. We can see that liberal feminism fails to equate women into society and only works to equate women by law. If we take further steps into gender equality, such as ensuring society that sees the genders as equal in practice and law, for this to occur, there would have to be a very loose concept of gender, such as no division of labor, meaning that it would not matter what gender you would identify as. This idea of gender is becoming more and more popular from its roots with third wave feminism, which mixed many ideologies such as postmodernism and intersectionality. But the question must be asked, in the hypothetical society, if gender is completely equal, why does gender exist? The answer to that question is gender would not exist. Fundamentally, the idea of gender is inseparable from your gender roles or how you act and present yourself in society. So the only way for a society to be gender equal is to not have a gender. Because if said society did have genders, then there must be a reason for the genders to exist, meaning that there would be inequities between the genders. The question that arises from all this information is, how would a society get to gender abolition?
Let me see what spring is like.
the solutions are very varied, but there are two to work with that I propose to get to this society. The first solution would be information. Understanding the concept so well that you're able to effortlessly answer all questions about the topic, or recommend many sources on feminist theories such as Angela Davis's Women, Race, Class to obtain more knowledge about the concepts of abolition. There are many ways you can inform yourself and others on this topic, but that is your path to choose. For the second solution, it may surprise you. Friendship sounds silly, like some fairy tale story, but it's the most important thing that a person can do. Power structures have to maintain themselves through their interest through isolation for them to be power. And every time the power structure do not stay isolated, the less power it holds in the future. This can be applied to the patriarchy as well. Friendship has been linked to happiness, increased empathy, and decreased feelings of loneliness in people. A study focused on empathy and friendships between children found, quote, children who lack positive friendships or are less socially skilled and therefore at risk of getting stuck in a various circle of having fewer empathetic skills and less friendship quality. This can directly apply to being a solution for solving the patriarchy, for instance. Men, especially men in very high positions of power, are humans just like everyone else. They possess the ability to empathize and understand situations. Men integrated in friend circles of positive thought can be transformed. Rather than men discussing with other men and staying isolated within their own group, they can talk to people who are outside of their own group and therefore come across new ideas, perhaps ideas that benefit their friends through the growth of empathy. Friendship is a concept that has been studied through and through, and it always concludes with people being better off, more happy, more empathetic, and having a more clear view of the world. The evidence of the power of friendship, it's no surprise that the conclusion to stopping the patriarchy would be friendship. The more friends that somebody who has progressive thoughts can make with power holders, the more likely it is that policy or better attitudes are held from men in context to women. If we were just to shun men and simply rely on the goodwill nature of a few to achieve gender equality, then we'd be waiting for an eternity. Instead, we can befriend power holders and make them into a more progressive group, slowly stripping the power of a once formidable structure.
In other words, hold my hand. In other words, darling,
I find the solution of friendship to be the answer to all types of oppression, race, class, and gender alike. For people to move forward, humanity must understand that it cannot survive being divided in a burning house, but it must break down the division and coalesce together to solve the problem. Thank you for watching my video. I know I missed out on a few concepts, specific concepts such as the idea of what it means to be transgender or intersex people, but the video was specifically oriented to describe the concept of gender abolition, and that's all it kind of aimed to do. But if anything else is needed for people to further their knowledge, I have the list of sources I used in the description, and thank you.